Hi, my name is Xing. I am an assistant professor of design and technology at Parsons.
And I'm Catherine Moriwaki, Associate Professor of Media Design at Parsons.
So today we have a very special guest, Bolor Amgalan, who is actually teaching the lab section for critical computation.
Hi everyone, my name is Bolor Amgalan. I'm a fashion design technologist and a hybrid interaction designer who's also a part-time faculty at Parsons teaching CC Lab. And today I'll be talking about my own creative practice and how it intersects with code and how it also deals with the critical theories about technology that we're learning in this course. So my fascination with code, specifically how code intersects with design, started when I started reading this book called A New Kind of Science by Stephen Wolfram, which is an over 1,000-page book on computational systems. In the book, Stephen Wolfram illustrates how simple programs defined by simple rules can exhibit highly complex characters and potentially lay the foundation for a fundamental theory of physics. And so I was basically really fascinated by this idea of simple rules that can act as the sort of foundational theory of how the universe functions. And an example of a simple program that brings about complex behavior is the cellular automaton. Here on the right, the top right, we have a simple rule determined for an elementary cellular automata. And the elementary cellular automata have two possible values for each cell, either a 0 or a 1, and rules that depend only on nearest neighbor values. In other words, what are the values for the cell next to the cell that we're determining, of either on the right side or on the left side. As a result of this simple rule, the evolution and progression of an elementary cellular automaton can be described by a table specifying the state a given cell will have in the next generation based on the value of the cell to its left and the value of the cell to itself and the value of the cell to its right. So if we follow the rule and use it to iterate over several generations, we'll basically get a pattern like the one in the bottom right. And here are some other examples of elementary cellular automata rules. And in fact, there are hundreds of these types of simple rules. And here there are patterns generated by these simple rules. So some of these patterns look like they're just sort of repeating the same triangle motif and maybe changing the orientation or scale of the triangle. But there are a few simple rules that actually exhibit sort of unexpected behavior. Here's also something much more complex. So Stephen Wolfram recently published a paper on a new class of rules that can generate complex patterns that actually resemble things that we know and see in nature. And some of these patterns here resemble, things like different proteins in our bodies and units of life. And so if cellular automata rules are applied iteratively over and over, they begin to create even more complex patterns over time. And here we can almost see three-dimensional shapes, things like sea creatures, plant species, and other things that we can almost identify. So I was very much interested in working with these concepts of continuous iteration and complexities derived from simple rules, which also had synergy with my prior work on modular fashion design, and really wanted to apply these scientific and mathematical concepts to fashion. And the way I wanted to accomplish that was by using simple equations to generate what is fairly simple shapes that can then be laser cut onto different types of fabrics. So in this case, I created this shape that you see at the top of the slide, modified it a little bit to generate a line drawing that is then used as a laser cutting template, which was laser cut into square sheets of wool suiting. And the wool suiting piece was then draped onto a mannequin to create different types of fashion forms. So this was kind of an inquiry into zero waste fashion aesthetic, and zero waste because when you're laser cutting into wool, you're able to save all of the off-cut materials that typically get produced in fashion production. There's also the advantage of sealing the edges of these fabrics with the heat that comes from the laser. And so by being sort of selective of the patterns that get generated by code, I essentially generated these zero waste laser cutting patterns. Here is another example that uses a tree-fractal cellular automaton. At the center of the slide, you can see the different forms generated on the mannequin as well. And there's also more examples of these zero waste designs that I came up with. The sort of defining, I guess, feature of this work is how there is this collaboration happening between what is used by the code that I write and what I then sort of modify and manipulate with my own hands. This is a collaborative sort of human-machine collaboration process. This theme of human-machine collaboration, human-machine symbiosis carries throughout most of my work. And here is another project that I worked on called the face test. The face test project essentially attempts to set the stage for debate about the implications of biometric technologies, specifically looking at how effective technology or technology that works with affective data or emotional data can have impacts on the most sort of private aspects of our lives. We already know that today we can computationally measure the amplitude of human emotions, and we're also making remarkable progress towards identifying specific types of emotions. But with all of these advancements, what are some of the unexpected consequences or unexpected implications of this work? And that was kind of what I was deeply interested in when I was working on this particular project. So staged as a scientific experiment that took place at the Dutch Design Week in 2017, the project used a galvanic skin response sensor, which is kind of well known as a lie detector that measures the amplitude of human sort of emotional arousal, how much you are emotionally being impacted by a given stimuli. Use this galvanic skin response sensor to determine the most emotionally arousing face by sort of visitors coming to Dutch Design Week. I created these standardized faces participants looked at while their emotional arousal level was monitored, and then mapped that data to the particular frame from this video that you see right now, and determines the face that correlates to the highest level of emotional arousal. And this was really just used as a starting point to begin to have discussion about some of the uncertainties around what emotional arousal actually means, what a galvanic skin response is actually measuring, and how we should really understand these different technologies holistically and not generalized. And a lot of people took it as a way to determine the face that they are most attracted to. People would comment on the project by saying things like, oh, you know, I could really imagine myself going out with this person, or I could really imagine myself being best friends with this person because this person actually, or this face actually resembles my best friend from, you know, high school or university or something like that. And then there were people who were kind of confused about the result that they got, and on a subconscious level, they're recalling that face, and therefore their emotional response is higher towards that particular face. Using this sort of setting and using this underlying sort of context, I then created this video which imagines the future of matchmaking in a sort of critical sense. And so what is funny is that this particular video was produced as kind of a critical design artifact to encourage critical debate, but also it was staged as a social experiment where I set up sort of fake website, matchclinic.com, and encouraged people to check it out. And I was getting a lot of people trying to get in touch with me to help them identify the most sort of compatible match for them, using all of the sort of different techniques that are featured in the video. So next is my MFA Design and Technology thesis project, which specifically looks at the human relationship with tools and by extension with technology. And this was kind of me going back to the sort of earlier concept I was dealing with around human-machine symbiosis and human-machine collaboration. I was specifically interested in how the human use of technology informs us back. And so there are basically a number of different ways we can conceptualize human becoming. Homo sapiens is, man as the wise or man as the knowing one is kind of the most dominant way we talk about ourselves. But there are also Homo ludens, Homo religiosus, Homo socius, and Homo faber was the concept that dealt with man as the tool maker or man as the maker in general. That was the focus of this particular project. This is because an increasing number of researchers and intellectuals now argue that human intelligence is the product of fabrication and product of making, as much as it is the product of Darwinian evolution by means of natural selection. And this quote by Henry Bergson, who's a French philosopher, captures, in my opinion, the essence of this argument. Intelligence, considering what seems to be its original feature, is the faculty of manufacturing artificial objects, especially tools to make tools, and of indefinitely varying the manufacture. I was interested in how we can better support the work of the Homo faber, or the work of the man as the maker, and how can we redirect technological progress in a more human-centric direction, while acknowledging the value of the sort of man-made or handmade object. And so to answer this question, I began creating this system that enables a VR, a virtual reality-based craft or making experience. And it uses simulated VR materials that react and behave similarly to like physical, real, textile materials. And the experience also uses hand tracking to allow the maker to manipulate these materials with their hands. And of course, there are certain nuances and complexities that come with working with one's actual hands that are getting reduced to hand models, 3D hand models in this experience. But really the point of the project is to provoke debate about what it means to have this symbiotic relationship with a machine or with technology or with your computer, and how can this technology also help us preserve some of the skills and some of the techniques that that come with practicing craft. So that was a demonstration of how the system works, and here is a trailer video for the project. And so the project really tackles the two values that are normally associated with craft. And one is material know-how, and the other one is time. So material know-how is something that you acquire when you work with a specific craft material for an extended period of time, and you learn how this material behaves in your hands and also over time. There's no sort of permanent way a certain material behaves, because materials will also behave differently in different conditions. When you start, for example, working with wood, itself is an anisotropic material, so it behaves differently along the grain of the wood as opposed to across the grain of the wood. Another example is wool. When you're working with wool, the more you beat the wool, the harder the wool gets. The material itself is kind of this dynamic thing that you have to learn to control. And even things like the oil coming from your hands, when you repeatedly work with a different type of wood, the wood absorbs that material, the wood absorbs that oil and becomes softer. So this relationship with a craft material is actually a very dynamic relationship. One question I wanted to ask myself through this project was, how can we create this sort of virtual material know-how in VR, and how can we create a heightened sense of embodiment in VR using these craft qualities? But also, how can then this VR environment help us become better at our craft? And the sort of answer, my attempt to answer the second question is this idea of time. So when you're a craft person working with a specific material, you really want to put in the time needed to learn to work this material, to learn the different nuances of the material. That requires a lot of dedication and patience. And so how can a virtual environment foster that kind of behavior? And so in answer to that, I created this environment that changes as time goes. So using time-based elements like sunrise, sunset, weather, these sort of natural phenomena, I wanted to create an environment that could potentially foster a type of handcrafting practice in VR. So that's it for my presentation, and thank you for watching.
So thank you so much, Bolor, for sharing your work. We really appreciate being able to see your presentation and have some insight into the work that you've been doing in the intersection between design and technology. So, one of the things that caught my attention from the last project that you were talking about, I was reminded of this article from 2018 where medical doctors are sort of beginning to notice that the students coming into med school have lost a certain degree of manual dexterity. The basic muscle memory and the manual dexterity needed to, say, for example, be able to suture a patient is something that the med students are increasingly just not well equipped to be able to do. And so I was really thinking about that article while you were talking about working with materials and the kind of skills and knowledge that is built when you're actually working with material in hand. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that relationship and your choice to try to recreate that in VR and what you think the implications of that might be.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a real problem, not just in the sort of medical field, but even in very hands-on design and art fields. There is the common critique that even fashion students today are graduating with not enough manual hand skills to be able to, create really refined, fine embroidery, for example. I think that is a problem that leads to, we can talk about fast fashion and how everything is now produced so fast. And it's because we have these machines that can do things a lot faster than we can with our hands. That part of the reason that's why we have the problem of fast fashion. I think there is a need to encourage people to go back to the sort of old ways of doing things in some respects. Just simply being comfortable with sewing a button, for example, and not having to rely on an expert to do that. And in terms of the kind of embodiment that I wanted to recreate in VR, craft lends itself really well for these kind of things, in my opinion, because the experience you're having in VR, and when you engage with something using your hands or using your entire body, it's a much more embodied and much more fulfilling experience. And so those are kind of the problem that I saw in the analog world, where we are now beginning to lose the hand dexterity and lose the sort of skills that I've acquired to do really basic things. Identifying that as a kind of a problem, but then identifying a potential solution, a potential sort of way to balance things out by recreating these sort of sensations and these ways of doing things in VR. I think I tried to, create that, debate around how human-machine symbiosis can actually be achieved.
Thank you so much for this presentation. I'm actually learning so much about your practice, and it's really nice to see the different works that you presented kind of juxtaposed as a lineage. I think what you brought up, like in the beginning of the presentation, relating to the desire of wanting to find a kind of like underlying rule set or underlying system of physics that's governing different kinds of ways of interaction or objects in the world. Like I think what you brought up in the first project is something that is becoming really dynamic in your last project, right? Like, because now, like when you're transitioning from the material world to the digital world, you actually have to make a lot of those decisions on how things translate, because a rope in a real world is totally different once translated into digital, when it becomes completely superficial in a way, right? It's just 3D model with textures on it. And it can easily be replaced by any other texture. And so how do you make those decisions on, you know, like what part of it has to stay really true to the original material, and what part of it sort of has to become compromised to the digital world?
Yeah, so I think the two values that I mentioned before, material know-how and time, I think those are two sort of guiding, I guess, principles when designing these hybrid or virtual materials. You know, analog materials have something to teach us. They make us play with them, and we have to learn to work with them. Similarly, I think digital materials should have something that gets revealed to us, and it's an embodied experience. It's not just a sort of visual, you know, simulated graphics. There is actually emphasis put on when something happens and what happens. So time becomes very relevant. A material may be not very stretchy in the beginning, but then it might become very stretchy and springy after a week. But as the practitioner playing with these materials in VR, you would only find out, you know, these properties if you actually put in the time and effort needed to learn these properties. So again, that's kind of encouraging this sort of dedication, patience from the practitioner, which analog craft is well known for. So I think material know-how and time are definitely the core guiding principles. And then on top of that, I think computation itself is, you know, it's powerful. That kind of adds another variable, I guess, to the equation. But those, you know, two principles from the analog world and computation, they kind of go hand in hand, and that relates back to this idea of human-machine symbiosis.
Wonderful. That answers my question. Thank you.
So this concludes the second portion of our lecture for this week. We want to give a really just a deep, heartfelt thank you to Bolor for joining us as our guest speaker for this section of CC lecture.